Come in. Did you get the time wrong? It was 6:30. You thought it was 7. Come in. There's seats at the front. Just come and walk round. Come and sit. There's seats at the front. Feel free. It's okay. So come and sit. There's more here. Just come sit down. There's one there, and there's a couple there. Okay.
One refugee from Uganda reported to us feeling the media had made the term asylum seeker a term of abuse. Quote, "It's like an abuse, even if someone wants to abuse you, even if you're not an asylum seeker anymore, just tell them you're an asylum seeker. An abuse now because of the media. Because of the media. Bogus. It's like calling you bogus because you eat food. I mean, the word asylum seeker is the same as bogus."
Britain, as part of the EU, must agree to share responsibility to relieve humanitarian need. And in doing so, it needs to find the best way to absorb refugees so that they can enrich the country and communities in which they enter. This rests on accurate and responsible reporting.
Attacks on refugees and on migrants go back a long way. These are, in a sense, old favourites of a right-wing media, and that they will be used and reinvigorated and grasped again by politicians as they are necessary in the political process. So we've gone through a period where you have, only 4 years ago, the bankers were the enemy and everything had gone wrong, But in a very short space of time, the issues of who is to blame, what is wrong, why is the government running out of money, why is there such a big deficit, why is Britain going bankrupt, I have to say, the kinds of rubbish that people are encouraged to believe like that are then linked to other issues like welfare, like migrants, like whatever, like disability, people on disability. And you find that when you go out to the focus groups and you start to ask people about what they understand about the world, people string together explanations which are really composed of tabloid headlines. So you say, for example, if we're doing a focus group, there's a deficit in the country. Why is there a deficit? Why would the government be running a deficit? And people say, oh, they've spent all the money on refugees. People actually reply that to that answer and to that question. And so you see much broader links in terms of how people are encouraged to think, how people are encouraged to believe. Now, of course, the journalists themselves know that this is rubbish. Most of the journalists you speak to realise this is ridiculous. The question is, how is all that sustained? How do they make young journalists behave? A journalist, a very senior Bird journalist, just talked about the culture of the newsroom, and it's awful. He just talked to me about the culture of bullying. He said, you've got to understand, he said, newsrooms are not democratic, they're autocracies. People are scared, they're frightened, they'll just be told to pack up their bags and get out. One journalist, this is from a national broadsheet, said to me, this is what he said, invariably it's the younger reporters who are sent out to do these sorts of monstering jobs. That's his word, it's a journalist term. Because they want to get on. The newsroom is an authoritarian place. A more experienced reporter could refuse. One editor had a terrible reputation for bullying, but the imbalance between news editor and young, inexperienced reporter is enough to get that person to put their conscience aside and go and monster an asylum seeker. Isn't that an extraordinary revealing word? To go and monster an asylum seeker, to turn somebody into a monster. And that's the words that they use. And when you go out to the focus groups and you ask people, you find that this language, the language of the tabloids, and indeed increasingly the language of the broadsheets, and indeed the television news, has become the language of our society. It's become the everyday, normalised language. And you say to people in the focus groups, can you write, they don't even know what they're coming to talk about. We don't give them any knowledge of what they're going to do. They just walk into the room and we say, we're going to talk about migration. They go, oh, right, okay. So, and nobody prepares anything. And we just say to them, write, just off the top of your head, write a headline about asylum or refugees. Right? And the ideology pours out of them. Nobody has any trouble at all. Just writing, because it's been normalised. It's the everyday language of speech. This is just a list of headlines written by people in focus groups. 300,000 refugees in Britain, 200,000 missing, refugees take over, crime rate increases in areas, asylum, more protests against volumes of asylum seekers, Britain being invaded, free homes for asylum seekers, refugees overflow, flood of refugees, government putting more stringent laws on migration, asylum seekers taking our benefits, more asylum seekers arriving from Afghanistan, crackdown on asylum seekers in hiding, Britain getting flooded by refugees. You know, headline after headline after headline they write. Without this any bother at all. Everybody can do this. You know? And then you find many people actually believe it, you know, in what they're saying. They believe that, you know, what they're being told. You know, and the consequences of that, as Pauline has said, and Emma, are dire for just for the refugees themselves, but also for other communities. What we found was that this culture of hatred, of stigma, of inviting people to hate other people, actually started to isolate and frighten and scare people who were long-established migrants in this country, people who were British citizens. We've got a lot of examples here of what it does to communities in Britain. There's somebody talking again. I've been raided about 5 times when I've been working. The way they treat you, that's the worst bit. It's like you're the criminal. And one man describes how being called out in the middle of the night because a van, one of his vans of his business, is stopped. And he's then questioned by the police. And he says, the question that annoyed me most was when he said, "Where are you from?" as a policeman. And I said, well, could you clarify that question? He said, "Where were you born?" I said, "Ealing in London." Then he said, "Ah, but where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from London." He goes, no, what's your ethnic background? I said, "I'm British or Scottish." But I knew where he was coming from. And people said, you know, how absolutely, you know, terrifying it was. And people saying, I don't count myself as from abroad. I've got the same rights as everybody else. I pay the same amount of tax. I do everything else. So why should they be treating us in this way? And another person who worked with asylum seekers and refugees in Glasgow talked about his own life. And he said how people liked to bully. He said what you see is that the press, the media coverage, legitimise the bullying of people. So it's as if it's now okay to bully weak, defenceless people because they have been stigmatised in this way. And he described how weird it was to have grown up in Glasgow. And as he said, what it meant to him, he was actually working with asylum seekers, but what it signified when this new layer of people came in who could now be bullied instead of him. And he describes it as follows. When asylum seekers came to Glasgow, I felt I had got a promotion. I felt I was promoted, even though I was born in Glasgow. But I was promoted from being racially beaten up, abused, marginalised for most of my life. But when asylum seekers came, I was now seen as Glaswegian. There was a boy who said to me, "You're all right now, but I don't like these new ones." I'd suddenly been promoted from the bottom rung to the next rung. And the boy had said now, because now there was a new group of people who could be marginalised and who could be bullied. And the culture that is created by the media is a culture of bullying. It's a culture of isolation, fear. It damages refugees, it damages British communities, it damages all of us. It's a vicious, unpleasant culture. There is opportunity in the sense that journalists are themselves worried and often very upset about this. The NUJ is trying to work on this issue. And the more we argue, the more we fight, the more chance there is that other voices, alternative voices, get on. And it's not, the issue is not just about refugees, it's about the whole way in which our society is being turned into a mean, unpleasant place in which it's safe for rich people, but nobody else. And I think that is the culture that we have to contest. Now, I'll hold that now, and we can talk a bit more and take questions, if that's okay.
Now we have the Home Office, which in the last week has said, now we're going to have immigration checks for every single tenancy in the country. Without any of this, I mean, regardless of where your politics lie in terms of immigration, there's been no discussion of, well, how do you actually plan on doing this? Is this a new development in terms of the lack of kind of critical reflection on these things, or has it always been the case?
No, not new at all. I mean, we were looking at these kinds of debates, I mean, from the 90s, but they certainly won't go right the way back, because I mean, you can go back to like Hartman and Husband in the 70s with different inflections on them. But the notion of migrants being treated as a threat and of developing and politicians exploiting potential race or racism in order to for political advantage is certainly not new. And but what I think you have now is a kind of race between the parties to say really stupid things on it. They're so scared of the their own focus groups and of what people are saying. They won't. I mean, I'm sorry. The point that Emma made is that just how ludicrous it is when you've got the Office of Budget Responsibilities saying that actually the figure they gave was 10 million migrants. They said Britain needs 10 million migrants, and they said that if without that, Britain would be spending something like 176% of its GDP within about 10 years, but because migrants are essentially much, much more productive than existing workers. That's not because they work harder, it's because you don't pay for them. All the skills you get for nothing, you're actually stealing the skills from the country that they come from usually. You haven't paid for the education, that they're young, they tend to be the youngest, fittest, strongest, they don't draw either welfare or health benefits, for a whole range of reasons. Migrant labour is very productive. And that was how they arrived at the calculation. But it was as if that story, is there for people like academics, or people like us to discuss. But I mean, it's so antithetical to the drive of what has been put out by the tabloids and by much of the media that it simply dies. It can't compute. And you can see the sheer crackersness of the policies in relation, for example, to foreign students. I mean, none of it makes any sense. They're prepared. You've got to see them. I think the politicians is to some extent a semi-separate class who are really only concerned about the next election. I do think it's about class structures and it's about power and the way in which they stabilise power for their own class. But I mean, they also engage in completely irrational behaviour in terms of the long-term interests of the country. I mean, like attacking foreign students, for example, classifying those as migrants. Any more questions, Gerald?
Sorry, I was just wondering, in terms of the content analysis that you did you sort of see similar trends in terms of the visual representations that were associated with refugees?
There were quite a lot of images of Sangatte that were being used repeatedly at a time, old images of Sangatte from like 2003 were being repeated. at the same time as they were talking about illegal immigrants.
Sangat was the most important one that kept coming back. And it was very interesting when, again, in the focus groups, we were interviewing people. I remember we did one group in Govan Hill, and I asked, as soon as we said about asylum seekers, refugees, what the group was about, people would say, oh yes, we've got a lot of those here, they're very dangerous, those refugees down the road. You know? And I was saying, really? And I said, well, who are they? And they were saying, all those ones who stand around, you know. And they were actually talking about Roma, right? And I said, you mean people from Eastern Europe who are Roma? They're like, oh yeah, that's it. And I said, well, actually, they aren't actually refugees, you know, they're just moving around. And they said, they look like refugees. That's what everybody was saying. They look like refugees. And I was saying, well, why is that? And I said, they stand around looking threatening. I mean, I have to say they don't anyway, the Roma. You know, what they do is stand around like it's a village square, and people just stand around and chat. You know, know Govan Hill quite well. But the point is, I then said to them, well, why would you think that is refugee-type behaviour? You know, what they were saying was, well, it's young men standing around looking threatening, you know. And of course you say, well, where'd you get that idea from? And they say, that camp place in France, you know, the swamp, you know. And let's go straight back to Sangat, you know. So it's actually an image by which refugee has become a term of abuse, really. And related directly back to the repeated use of Sangat as a visual image in terms of what is supposed to be happening. You know.
How much would you say this manipulation of baser human emotions is something that is partaken of by newspapers and politicians in order to gain power and make money? And how much would you say is just human nature to seek out outrage because of the reward system the brain would deliver that rush of adrenaline for getting that pissed off about something?
Well, I think people have the capacity to do very many things, you see, and I don't like using words like human nature, because otherwise this room wouldn't be full of people who think it's appalling to treat people in that way. You know, I think it's easy to encourage fear in people. I think people can be made scared and made frightened, and I think, as I said, it is very easy, you know, in a situation where people are already troubled, where they're worried, where they're worried about jobs, they're worried about pensions, they're worried about housing, where, you know, in the situation now we've had this quite severe cut in real wages for the bulk of the population. It is the case that very, very many people feel pressured and frightened. And I think in that situation, it's easy to find scapegoats. I mean, it can be anybody. The press could deal with this in different ways. I mean, they could say, look, if people come into a new community, there need to be resources for them to settle. That actually migrant labour is extremely productive. It actually increases the tax revenue of the society and pays for the hospitals and the schools. And that's the truth, right? But in the absence of the truth, it's easy to generate fear. And I don't think people, you know, will automatically want to go and hurt and kill people. I think people are encouraged in one direction or another. I don't think it's a natural disposition to want to hate somebody. But I do think when people are under pressure, that is a way in which people can be moved very quickly. And we can see lots of evidence of that.
The focus of the debate around deportation tends to focus on these horrible characters that they can sort of present as evil and scary. And yet this is something that more widely impacts on so many refugees who are more likely to be victims of violence or crimes than perpetrators of it. And so it is very much sort of channeling fear in a particular direction in order to justify things like getting rid of our Human Rights Act. And it's ramping up people's fear. And of course, you know, people get aggressive when they're scared. But I think it's, yeah, as Greg said, I mean, it's it's testament to how much people care that everyone is packed out and standing all around the back here today. So, yeah.
And
Sorry,
also,
anyway.
You find when you talk to people, there is such a mixture of beliefs when you talk to people, when you go out into the focus groups. You know, the same people who will say to you, it's appalling, you know, it's awful that the electricity companies have been, are in private hands, you know, that these are owned by, you know, French or German or multinationals, and the prices are going up, and electricity, and it's awful. It's absolutely shocking that these things were privatised, and they, you know, it's absolutely. And you can have a whole focus group saying this, and the same people and say, of course, Margaret Thatcher was the most wonderful politician, you know, the same people, and you have this, and there's such a disconnection in what people think. You know, the same people who are down, you know, charity shops helping in Oxfam will also think, oh well, you know, it's very, you know, it's of course, you know, we ought to help people, but we, you know, we're a crowded island and we can't keep taking everybody. You know, it's just it's easy to manipulate fear when you keep people ignorant. Yeah. And I think that is the key to it. And I think there's a lot of goodwill in this country towards, you know, helping other people. People want to have a decent life. They want to have everyone to have a decent life. They want good healthcare. They want good, you know, social relationships with other people. They don't want, you know, to see suffering. But people feel overwhelmed. You know, they don't understand what's going on in the world. I mean, if you look at the coverage of the rest of the world, it's as if as soon as you get, you know, a bit past Europe, the entire world is nothing but war. You know, it's nothing but chaos and war, and people are scared, and they become, you know, almost inured to war. You know, it's as if they don't, and they say, well, we can't take them all, because they're listening to television programs which are saying, you know, there's 190 million refugees in the world, and Britain takes, you know, is in the top 10 countries for taking these, and you think, what? You know, and the whole notion that actually refugees almost always go to the country next door. You know, they go to the great bulk of refugees don't all get on a plane and come to Britain. I mean, it's just ridiculous to suggest something like that. And if you worked out those figures as we did, it would suggest that if we were taking a tenth of 190, whatever, you added it all up, it comes, you know, became something like 9 million people that they're conjuring up as an image of coming to Britain. And, you know, even UKIP isn't saying that. You know, I mean, you know, so you've got figures on BBC Two Newsnight which are way above what you know, Nigel Farage is saying or anybody else. You know, it's but people get scared by all of this, and instead of saying, well, actually, this, you know, we have a deep moral responsibility for this. And I don't know if you saw the programme, we quote it in this book, the End of the Line one, which is about fishing, you know, and a tremendous film. And there's a moment in it where they make these links between what we do in the West or in the developed world and what happens in the undeveloped world. And they go to Africa, to an area along the coast which had been a very prosperous fishing area. And they go to the area, and what has happened is, and this was a very rich, very prosperous, very fine part of Africa, no problems. And what has happened is that European and other factory trawlers have hoovered the sea, just stolen all the fish, taken you know, literally everything. So there's nothing alive left in the sea. And people, then the whole fishing industry collapses. The African fishing industry collapses. And the people in the villages say, we used to be really well off here, we used to find, you know, and they're talking to old men in the villages. And they said, we used to be fine here. But then all the industry collapsed, you know. So our young men had to go to Europe to look for work because we had to survive. And he said, and then he says, it turned out you didn't like our young men as much as you liked our fish. You know? And that kind of brutally sums up that relationship. But, you know, the problem is that people here don't see that relationship. They just see Africans fighting each other, or, you know, and without anybody making the point. Whenever you're in the news, has anybody ever said, when they talk about people coming from Iraq or Afghanistan, you know, that making the link that actually it was us that invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, one of the reasons these countries are in such an appalling state is exactly because of what we did to them. You know, and then it's like saying, you know, you like dropping bombs on us, but you don't like it when we have to move. You know, and those connections are not made. So those connections have to be made. We have to push those into the media. We have to push those into public consciousness. And that is part of the struggle, part of the ideological struggle in which we're involved.